All right. This next guy is a professor of cybersecurity at the University of Maryville, and he's a principal consultant at Portunus Consulting. Kurt Aubuchon.
Okay, I guess that's just going to stay there. Hi, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming to my talk. Aha, there we go. So thanks very much for coming to my talk. My name is Kurt Aubuchon, and I do a couple different things. I have a computer forensics and incident response consulting service called Portunus Consulting. And as mentioned, I'm also an assistant professor of cybersecurity at Maryville University. And there's a little bit about me and all my alphabet soup and all that kind of fun stuff. So this talk might be a little bit different than some of them that you have here at ShowMeCon this year. And by the way, can you guys in the back hear me okay? Cool. So this talk was kind of inspired by and in response to a paper that kind of went around the international relations and foreign policy community by a guy named Richard Andres. Richard Andres was one of the national security advisors to a couple different presidents, including President George W. Bush. And earlier this year, Andres published a paper in a couple of foreign policy journals called Cyber Conflict and Geopolitics. And I said, Andres is a longtime national security and military guy, and I'm going to tell you why he's wrong. So, or at least why I think he kind of misses a little bit of what is going on. So Andres talks about, he starts his paper talking about great geopolitical shifts. And he outlines a couple of different times when, in his view, one country sort of was out in front of a new technology. One country was really in the forefront of developing some new technology, and then that country was ultimately threatening Great Britain's global hegemony. So this is all kind of my quick summary of what Andres' argument is. And so Richard Andres goes on to say that he thinks that we are seeing a third great geopolitical shift, and this time in cyberspace. His argument is that the United States led the development of internet technology and communication technology and so on, and he believes that we're in danger of being eclipsed by other powers that are going to sort of embrace that technology and do it better than us. So he says that we should sort of heed the warnings of Spain in the 16th century and Great Britain in the 18th century. So Andres points to three main areas of concern. He talks about active measures, influence operations, and economic attacks. So we're going to talk a little bit about what Andres' argument is in each of these, and I'll kind of add some context and some of where I think Andres is actually right in many of these areas, and I'll kind of add some context around his argument. So first, Andres talks about, First, Andres talks about active measures. And with active measures, what he's talking about are ways and are incidents when one adversary interferes with the other adversary's critical infrastructure and so on. Now, as many of you guys and as many of you all in this room are, I'm sure, aware, Stuxnet in 2010 kind of ushered in the age of cyber warfare. Now, although it's never been like officially admitted, pretty much everyone knows that the U.S. and Israel worked together to unleash Stuxnet in an effort to disrupt processing at an Iranian nuclear power plant, or nuclear enrichment facility, rather. So this was sort of the first time that a cyber weapon was used in an active measures campaign, at least that we are aware of. Now, what was pretty cool about Stuxnet, again, as many of you in this room probably know, is that Stuxnet subtly altered the programmable logic controllers managing the centrifuges at these enrichment facilities. Now, I'm not a nuclear scientist, of course, but as I understand it, enriching uranium is a very precise process. And if your centrifuges spin just a little too fast or a little too slow, you don't get things that go boom at the end, right? You don't get the uranium that you want. So Stuxnet kind of fiddled with the PLCs, programmable logic controllers, so that the centrifuges would not spin at the correct rate, but the PLC would continue to tell the operator that it was spinning at the right rate. So the guy managing the system would see, oh, it's spinning at whatever, 7,000 RPMs or something like normal, but we're not getting things that go boom, something is wrong. And so that put the Iran's nuclear project back a few years. Now, and so I'm sort of trying to be objective and sort of not take sides on this. That is sort of good as far as it goes, right? But I think it's relatively easy to imagine that the U.S. and Israel could have set the centrifuges to go into a unsafe state. They could have made the centrifuges blow apart or cause damage to the machines or injure or kill the operators standing next to them. And so Stuxnet was I guess sort of notable not only for the new technology, but for the kinds of attacks that it sort of hinted at or sort of foreshadowed. And, I say I don't want to take sides. I'm a patriotic American and so on, but I just want to stick to sort of the, somewhat objective and technical aspects of this. Okay, so then in 2015, things started to get a little more interesting when Russia compromised some power plants in Ukraine. Compromised the distribution system. Russia and Ukraine were fighting at the time, and Russia compromised the Ukrainian power distribution system and cut off power to about 200,000 people in Kiev. And then in 2016, or a year later, Russia did the same thing again as part of their conflict. In 2017, FireEye released some research on a group they called Triton, which FireEye did not identify the target country, but they talked about how the Triton threat actor, I think probably presumed to be perhaps Russia, tampered with the safety systems on some of these industrial control systems. So, I mentioned earlier that you can imagine that if U.S. and Israel had wanted to blow up the Natanz plant, they could have done it. Well, that's probably true, but these industrial control systems have a safety system that's separate and apart from the PLC. What Triton did, for the first time that we know of, is it tampered with those safety systems so that they could get an unsafe condition and the safety systems would not stop it, right? So they were able to override the brakes on the system, override the safety controls. So this is, again, kind of another escalation in cyber attacks being used as part of active measures. Now, in the United States, about 90% of our critical infrastructure, which is things like power plants and dams and water treatment facilities and sewer and all that kind of stuff, 90% of that is in private hands or private companies. So we have this sort of hodgepodge of private companies managing our security infrastructure. Security measures vary widely, and there's very little coordination among these companies. So, for example, I just kind of, when I Googled PLC to get a sort of a stock image of a PLC controller, I got this person here on the left, just kind of by happenstance, who is operating a water control system in Freer, Texas. So you can see this person here has got a PLC, or basically just a plain old PC with which she is managing the water control system. And I don't know what that is, but it looks like some sort of mix of chemicals or whatever. So that's just a plain old PC, right? How easy do you think it is to compromise that plain old PC and do some sort of unauthorized change or some sort of damage to the water control system? So I was kind of interested in, well, what is Freer, Texas, and what is their water company like? Is this like a really big, sort of mature company that we think is doing security well? That's the water company in Freer, Texas. That's it. That's the whole company right there. Their online presence is a Facebook page and then some third-party company that they contracted for bill collection. So these people, I'm not trying to I guess I am trying to sort of mock them, but they're probably civil engineers, and there's probably some sort of accounting, customer service people. Right, they're not security people, and from the looks of it, they're probably kind of operating maybe on a slim budget, and they probably don't really have a whole lot of resources to protect their security. So in the sort of active measures, right, if we get into a fight with another country and they want to use cyber attacks as an active measure, these are probably the kind of targets that they're going to go after. Because they can go in, and as we've seen when Stuxnet and Triton and all these other attacks, everyone now who's into that sort of thing knows how to fiddle with these things effectively so that the operator doesn't know what's going on, and hey presto, you've just put too much chlorine in the water, or you've just mixed two chemicals and caused an uncontrolled reaction or something like that. So that's, Andres talks about these sorts of things, and yeah, I've kind of added a few examples just to be frightening, I guess. But I think Andres is right about that cyber operations are going to be more and more a part of active measure, or active measures done through cyber operations are going to be more and more a part of any conflict that we find ourselves in going forward. Okay. Next, Andres talks about influence campaigns. And of course, the big example of this is in the run-up to the 2016 presidential election. Russia carried out this big, multifaceted influence campaign to sort of undermine confidence in U.S. elections and undermine confidence in U.S. institutions. And they did this through basically propaganda on Facebook and Twitter and social media and so on, and also through hacking the democratic organizations and releasing documents on blogs through this online persona of Guccifer 2.0. These are carried out by the FSB and the GRU. The FSB is kind of analogous to our CIA or FBI, kind of a hybrid of the two. And the GRU is Russian military intelligence. The GRU was actually the one who did the most damage. They were the ones who actually got into John Podesta's email and got into the DNC and things like that. And that online persona, Guccifer 2.0, was traced back to a GRU unit. And then they also did the social media propaganda efforts run by this group called the Internet Research Agency. And, so this was, I think, showing how, it's relatively easy to carry out an influence campaign with social media. Over the past couple of days, you guys have probably been seeing a few articles about deep fakes and how they're getting really good at faking people talking, right, or doing fake videos. So the AI is getting a lot better, and it's relatively easy now to take a famous person and manipulate the video so it appears that they're saying something that they're really not. There's a video of Mark Zuckerberg going around on Facebook now where they have Zuckerberg saying all kinds of crazy things, which is just fake, right? And there's a website called This Person Does Not Exist, I think, where you can go and you can get sort of an AI-generated face that looks pretty real, but it's just a completely random but realistic looking face. So those are good for things like fake social media profiles. Right? It used to be that if you wanted to set up a fake social media profile, you had to go out and get a stock image or something, right? And you could just do a reverse Google image search and find out where the stock image came from. But you can't really do that anymore because you can go to This Person Does Not Exist, get a fake picture of a person that looks very real, and Google reverse image will never find it because it's not an image anyplace, right? So anyways, Andres talks a lot about influence campaigns using internet and social media and so on. Russia, shortly after the DNC hacks and the election interference, Russia carried out some similar campaigns against the World Anti-Doping Agency in retaliation for some Russian athletes being banned for doping. So the third sort of main area of concern that Andres talks about, and again, where I think he's right, is economic attacks or economic disruption. Now, in the 20th century, about 80% of corporate wealth was in tangible things like inventory, right? It was in stuff, finished goods, machines, materials. In the 21st century, 80% of corporate wealth is in intellectual property and trade secrets. I used to work for a manufacturing company here in St. Louis. They made big machines that did auto service. So, like, you roll into the shop and the lift lifts up your car. Right? I worked for a company that made those kinds of things and brake lathes and whatever. And it took me a little while to convince them that no one's going to come in and steal a lift from your factory, right? Your threat is people stealing the source code that runs those things, right? Or stealing the R&D for the next generation of lifts. Right? All of the value of the company now is in intellectual property. So, of course, we're all worried about criminals stealing from companies, but nation states are big thieves of intellectual property and trade secrets as well. You all may remember this from a year or two ago, where by abusing the Border Gateway Protocol, a bunch of internet traffic was, for reasons no one has ever sufficiently explained, was routed through China, right? And so instead of, if you were trying to send internet traffic from New York to London for some strange reason, it would go through China. Like, wow, that's odd. And it has not been proven, but it appears to be that China was able to abuse the BGP to perhaps sniff a bunch of internet traffic. And China's really pretty open about stealing trade secrets, right? It's just, it's really pretty much an open secret that that's what they're doing. Excuse me. Okay, sorry about that. All right, so these are all things that Andres talks about. And I think he's really right about all these things. I think, and again, not a surprise probably to many of you here, that cyber operations are going to increasingly be a part of any conflict that we're in. If we're in, military people call it a kinetic conflict, right? Kinetic attack is when things go boom, right? Is when you shoot something or drop bombs on something. So I think cyber attacks are going to increasingly be a part of any kinetic conflict that we find ourselves in. Influence operations and using the tools of mass communication for propaganda. That's always been with us, right? We've always engaged in propaganda efforts against other countries and they against us, but it's going to get easier and sort of more effective. And economic disruption is going to continue to be a big part of cyber operations. So the challenges for us as defenders, well, one, we have the open nature of the internet. Right? The internet wasn't really intended to be sort of our main communication method and, the way by which we all get through our lives. And so it's, the open and sort of, fluid nature of the internet makes it difficult for us as defenders to defend our stuff. Lack of coordination among targeted enterprises. So get back to the fact that about 90% of our critical infrastructure is in private hands. Many of them don't really communicate with each other. Now you have efforts like InfraGard and so on that are trying to get people to talk to each other. And those are sort of helpful, but not necessarily comprehensive. And in fact, there's actually an incentive, or there are incentives for secrecy when companies get attacked. Right? The incentive is for them not to tell anybody because we don't want to be embarrassed. So, if there were a active measures campaign in cyberspace against the U.S., I think we'd be at a real disadvantage because you could knock down the water treatment plant in Freer, Texas, and it would be, I think, very difficult for other water treatment plants to know that it had happened, to know what happened, to know how to defend against it. Not only because Freer, Texas probably doesn't have, really highly skilled incident response people at the ready, but also because even if they did, their incentives and their instinct would be to keep it quiet, right? We also have a low supply of skilled security practitioners. That's great for me as a professor because it's easier for me to help my students find jobs, right? But not so good for the people who are trying to protect their stuff because it's difficult to find enough good people to protect yourself against people like the Russians or highly resourced and highly skilled nation-state attackers. Difficulty of attribution. Even when something does get hacked, it's always difficult to know who really did it. And I think lots of times companies, if they don't really know, they just say it was probably North Korea or China. Oh, yeah, of course, it's North Korea. Yeah, those guys again, right? But really, it's difficult to attribute attacks. Sometimes they get pretty close, but it's really, even if we sort of, even if we're talking to each other, even if everyone is sort of more upfront about the fact that they were attacked, it's difficult for us to know who did it, who do we blame for it, and if we're in an active measures campaign, who do we retaliate against? This is kind of an interesting little anecdote since I have a couple minutes. In the DNC attack, so you may remember that there was this online persona named Guccifer 2.0 who gathered all these documents from the DNC and John Podesta's email and so on, and then posted them online, right? Guccifer had this WordPress site where they would post these documents and they would go on Twitter and say, hey, go look at this most recent dump of so-and-so's emails. So, the Guccifer 2.0 people, because there were more than one, used a VPN called Elite VPN that was an anonymizing VPN, right? So whenever they would go on Twitter or log into their WordPress account, they would go through this Elite VPN, and so it was hard to know where they were coming from. Except that one time when they didn't, right? When whoever was logging into Twitter messed up, forgot to use Elite VPN, and logged in from their desk, which was in the GRU headquarters in Moscow. So when this was in some of the Robert Mueller indictment reports. So they talked about how there's at least one time when they left their real IP address in the logs of, I think, Twitter or WordPress. So sometimes it's easy to attribute attacks, right? But generally, the attackers are a little more consistent than that. And of course, the enormous complexity of networks. Obviously I'm an information security guy. I sort of, like everyone else, I point and laugh at companies that get hacked, that didn't do a good job. But really, deep down in my heart of hearts, I know that it's kind of impossible to protect a modern company from getting breached. If your attacker really wants to get in, they're going to get in, aren't they? Because our networks are enormously complex. We have, everyone has their own devices. Everyone wants to work remotely. Right? And so if the bad guys want to get in, they're going to get in. So that again puts us at a disadvantage, especially if we're talking about some sort of active measures thing. You guys have all heard this cliche, right? The good guys have to be right all the time. The bad guys only have to be lucky once. A couple examples of that. In 2017, the Equifax compromise. One of my good friends was one of the directors of the of the incident response team at Equifax. And I'm pretty sure that what happened was, out of the thousands of servers that Equifax has facing the internet, they missed a patch on 2 of them. Right? So I'm not trying to excuse Equifax, right? They probably should have done better. And there's sort of this, comedy of errors that led to them missing this patch, right? The CMDB wasn't updated. The guy who was supposed to patch it was on vacation or whatever. But really, it's out of the thousands of servers they managed, they missed a patch on 2, and it led to a couple 100 million people's information being compromised. Or again, going back to the GRU attack, when they got John Podesta's email, it was because the security guy at the Hillary Clinton campaign just flat out goofed and missed a phishing email. Right? Podesta got this phishing email, and he sent it to the security guy saying, "Is this legitimate?" The security guy said, "Yeah, that's legitimate. Go ahead." And Podesta gave his password to the Russians. So, again, it's the defenders are at a really distinct disadvantage, right? So if we're talking about things like active measures or economic interruption or interference and so on, We in the U.S. are probably at a disadvantage because of our sort of highly decentralized nature and because of the the sort of nature, sort of the hodgepodge patchwork of our critical infrastructure and so on. Okay, so I think where Richard Andres kind of gets a little off track here is he thinks that we're in a period that's similar to the shift of naval power and the shift of rail power. And he, I think, paints a picture of a future in which U.S. Global hegemony and global dominance in cyberspace is going to be threatened, and there's going to be some other new cyber power that's going to basically, be the dominant cyber power. I think he's sort of not quite right about that. So there's some differences between today and the past sort of geopolitical shifts that I think make today probably a little scarier. So first of all, there are very low barriers to entry, right? So back in the old days, the kind of the geopolitical shifts that Andres was talking about, if you wanted to become a naval power in the 17th, 18th century, you got to build ships, right? You have to build all these ships, and you gotta, have all these ports, and you gotta build, buy all the cannons, and you feed all these sailors, right? If you want to become a rail power, you have to build a railroad, right? Russia was a great rail power, but they had to build a railroad clear across the country, right? But what's the barrier to entry to becoming a cyber power? There really is none, right? Look at, for example, the Russian influence campaign that caused so much disruption in the U.S. in 2016. How many people carried that out? It was probably a couple dozen guys with laptops, right? Probably just not even very good laptops, right? Because how much laptop power does it take to send a phishing email, right? Or to go register for Elite VPN. So the low barriers to entry and the low cost of operations, I think, is a big difference between now and before. I don't think we're going to see a period where there's going to be one dominant cyber power that emerges out of the chaos. I think we're seeing a period where it's going to be continued chaos with lots of small players who are able to sort of have outsized influence. The conflict that we're in now is very asymmetrical. Look, for example, at North Korea. North Korea is a pretty prominent and pretty effective player in cyber operations, right? Look what they did to Sony, for instance, in retaliation for that dopey movie they put out, right? North Korea is a tiny, impoverished country. Like, most of the country doesn't even have electricity, but they're able to be a cyber power. So I think that what the period that we're getting into is not that North Korea is going to become the dominant cyber power, or China is going to become the dominant cyber power. I think we're entering into a period where everyone's going to be sort of sniping at each other. All these sort of small players are going to kind of rise and fall in prominence. Maybe for a year, maybe for a year, South Africa is going to be the dominant cyber power, and then, at some other point, it's going to be, Argentina, and then, because there's no barrier to entry, and as long as you have a couple dozen guys with laptops, you can go create all kinds of havoc. So I think the notion that we're going to have one dominant cyber power is somewhat outdated. I think we're entering a period where the concept of whoever is sort of winning at any given time is going to be very fluid. Also, we have the ease of surprise. It's kind of hard to surprise someone with the fact that you are building a railroad, right? It's kind of hard to surprise someone with an aircraft carrier anymore, right? Pretty easy to surprise somebody with a DDoS attack, though, isn't it? Pretty easy to break into Freer, Texas, and poison everyone's water completely by surprise. Difficulty of assessing impact. This is especially true on the economic side. How do you assess the impact if, for example, China steals a bunch of intellectual property from a major American company? The major American company probably can't even really assess the impact, right? How do they place a value on their R&D for the product that they were supposed to release, next year, year after next. And if they can't assess the impact, and if we can't assess the impact, then how do we retaliate for it? What do we do with? Well, you went and did this economic impact. We're not really sure how bad it was. Don't do that again, you crazy kids. Right? Again, the difficulty of attribution. Sometimes we can attribute it, but oftentimes we can't. The Sony attack, everyone's pretty sure it was North Korea, but we're not really sure. I mean, if we're going to retaliate against North Korea with a kinetic attack, is pretty sure, is that good enough? Or do we want to be really sure it was them before we touch off the cruise missiles, right? Which brings me to my last point, kind of rolling these all up. We have this undefined threshold for retaliation. So the United States, I think last year, Department of Defense issued a white paper saying that we reserve the right to respond to cyber attacks with kinetic attacks. Right? So the Department of Defense says, if you hack us, we might bomb you. But what's the threshold for that? Right? How much of a cyber attack are we willing to take before we go out and bomb somebody? I don't think anybody really knows that yet. Right? And so I think this all, again, adds up to we're kind of entering this very chaotic political atmosphere where we're all going to be attacking each other, seeing how much we can get away with. We're all going to be getting increasingly sophisticated with our active measures and with our influence campaigns and everything. How much can we get away with? How sophisticated can we get before someone presses the button, right? Or how sophisticated can we get? How much can we, if we DDoS this company over here, who are they going to DDoS in return, right? Or if if one country shuts down the water treatment plant in Freer, Texas, what is our response, right? Is that enough to elicit a kinetic response, or do we go and try to hack one of their water plants? So I think we're entering. So I think again we're noted national security expert Richard Andres is wrong, and I, Kurt Aubuchon, cybersecurity guy, am correct. Is that Andres, I think, is looking at this from sort of a historical view of someone's going to be the global dominant power. And I think what's going to be the global dominant situation is this going to be a long period of chaos and sort of asymmetrical conflict. And recent development, just 2 weeks ago, Israel announced that they had taken a cyber attack. Israel didn't really say what it was, just a cyber attack that they attributed to Hamas. Israel said that they counteracted the attack, and then they blew up the building where they believed the Hamas cyber attackers were working from. This is believed to be the first time when a country responded to a cyber attack with a kinetic attack. And so I think we're all kind of waiting to see how this shakes out, right? Will the international community think that that is proportional? Or, are we all going to kind of think that that was overkill? Right? What is a proportional response to a DDoS attack, right? Or to, again, a critical infrastructure attack? So it was interesting that this was the first attack. I offer no political opinions on whether this is good or bad, but we, as an international community, we have to decide what is a proportional response. And we just don't know yet. Okay, so I did not go as long as I thought I would go. I'll be happy to answer any questions to the extent that I can. Yeah.
So you mentioned InfraGard. I was there this year at the State of Cyber, and one of the things they talked about was many of these major Fortune 500, Fortune 100 companies are actually looking at cybersecurity insurance. Mm-hmm. And if they are breached, being compensated for that, the amount of time in remediation and the amount of time potentially in IP loss, like you talked about. But you also talked about the difficulty of assessing damage. Mm-hmm. From a corporate perspective, how do you feel the efficacy of these insurance programs and, frankly, their ethical and moral implications? If I can't assess how much damage was done, how much are these companies going to end up paying out, if at all?
Yeah, and I don't. So the question for those of you who may not have heard was, cyber insurance is becoming more common, and sort of what are the implications of that, especially if you can't do a good job of assessing the damage. And that's another area that I think we're getting closer to a level of maturity in cyber insurance, but we're not quite there yet. One company I worked at recently did buy cyber insurance. It was actually, I remember 8 or 10 years ago at a previous company, I looked at cyber insurance, and it was crazy expensive, and there was this audit that no way my company could have passed, and so it was just, it was a very sort of onerous process to get cybersecurity insurance. Now the insurance industry has matured a lot. Now, oftentimes there's not even any audited anymore. Right, and the insurance company doesn't even bother to come in and check your controls beyond sort of a very cursory look, and it's a lot cheaper now. So, most of the insurance I'm aware of covers things like cost of litigation or cost to go out and hire incident response personnel. They don't really do a very good job of covering the cost, like the loss of intellectual property. Right? Because again, how do you know, right? So, let's say a competitor comes in and steals your design for next year's product. Well, your insurance will pay for things like your forensics, you're suing them, whatever, but it's probably not really going to compensate you for whatever market share you lost, right? One interesting wrinkle is most cyber insurance policies that I'm aware of will compensate you if you pay the ransom, if you get ransomware. Okay? So, and that kind of gets to the more sort of the ethical, like social good kind of discussion, right? Because if you get ransomware, the FBI is going to say, don't pay the ransom, because number one, you're not sure you're going to get the key, but number two, don't feed the beast, right? Don't encourage the bad guys. But the FBI doesn't have to run your company, right? There was last year there was a city government, a small city in Texas, that was knocked completely offline by ransomware. Their emergency services was down, their bus was down, everything was down. People couldn't pay their bills for weeks. And they had insurance to pay the ransom, and they paid the ransom. The FBI told them not to, but they went ahead and paid it because the FBI doesn't have to make sure the buses run, right? The FBI isn't manning the 911 system in this town. So it is an ethical problem, right? Because now your insurance company is making it so there's no real economic disadvantage to paying the ransom, right? Like, why not pay the ransom? We're paying the insurance company for this. And you have an incentive to pay because you want to get your business back up, but you know that by paying, you're just feeding the bad guys, right? So, I don't know. Right?
That's a great answer. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Yeah.
I just want to offer an observation that kind of goes with that. I just heard in the news maybe a couple of weeks ago that some victims of ransomware went to their insurance companies. They had cyber insurance policies. The insurance company declined to pay. Wow. And the rationale for not paying was that it was an act of war because somebody had tried to turn it back to Russia.
Wow. So for those of you who may not have heard in the back, there was some companies that got ransomware. They paid the ransom, asked their insurance company to reimburse them. Insurance company said no because it was an act of war. Traced it back to Russia. That's very clever. I think there's a question over here. Yeah.
Segue Russia. So the Mueller report obviously was where you got a lot of your data from. Having read it, part one, I mean, what are we doing to prevent that? I mean, they already got ransomware. So
right.
They already won. How are we correcting that? Or is Facebook's change, even though, I don't know why he has that out there. He wants to demonstrate that that you can't believe anything on his site with his film running on himself, just saying all this stuff.
Yeah.
But what have we done? Less the company, 90% private infrastructure, right? What have we done government-wise to solve part one remotely?
Yeah, so I don't have a lot of. The question is, what have we done to sort of prevent a replay of the 2016 election interference? And to be honest, I'm not sure they've done a whole lot. So the people who were sort of on the front lines of the Russian election interference were people like the Clinton campaign, the Democratic National Committee, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. So I hope that the Democratic organizations have sort of learned their lesson and gotten better, but I don't know, right? A lot of them are, a lot of them are sort of largely volunteer run. They're going to be spending as much money as they can on campaigns. How much money are they going to spend on security?
The government supposedly spent $200-400 million, even Trump, okay, to go and support the voting infrastructure.
Right.
What do they do?
That's unclear. Yeah, that is unclear to me. Right? Yeah, yeah, it's really unclear to me, right? Because again, the government might, the feds might be able to do things like protect federal agencies, right? But they can't really force the Democratic National Committee to do better. And because we have
Republicans were hacked too.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, they were. Yeah.
They didn't even have a reason to spread it out.
Right. And you mentioned voting, right? Who runs our voting system in the U.S.? Counties, right? And there's how many counties are there in the U.S.? Like a zillion, right? So. I am not doing. So, I want to avoid getting into a political discussion because I don't want like rotten fruit to be thrown back and forth across the room. So,
it doesn't matter what.
Yeah, but as far as what we're doing, I think clearly we are not doing enough. Clearly, I think at the federal level, the government appears to have other priorities at the moment. Poisoning water supply. So I think we're probably, so we need to do better, but we just haven't, I don't think we've really fully protected ourselves against another 2016. Yeah, we'll find out in about a year, right? Other questions, comments, snide remarks, yeah.
I kind of piggyback a little bit on this question. I'm just wondering, the size of USA in general, such a big country, right? And if you get smaller countries, you can kind of allocate more resources on a government level to actually have to actually spend a lot of money on what we're doing, I guess, in cybersecurity. We do have the money, but because we have such a big country with so much bigger infrastructure, do you have any insight into on CIA level, are we trying to insource a lot of the brain capital around the world that could be a potential threat to us? Are we bringing them in here in the country? In other words, what are we doing to kind of incentivize people in cybersecurity so they can go work with CIA and work with CIA or FBI and be able to protect their information?
Yeah, so what are we doing to incentivize people to do things like, work for CIA, FBI, et cetera, right? So, like everyone, they're competing to pay us enough, right? So, I don't know kind of what their pay structure is like. I do know that people like the FBI are talking to me, trying to get my students to come work for them. They do have a hard time paying as much as the students are going to get in the private sector. Also, you can go work for a CrowdStrike and do cool stuff, and you don't have to run a mile and a half in under 10 minutes, right? Like you do for the FBI or whatever the number is. So those guys do have are at a disadvantage when it comes to, compared to the private sector. But I mean, I do know that, we have, recently, I think, kind of in the U.S., we have a cyber command, which is separate from, the Department of Defense, a cyber command, which is separate from, like, the infantry and so on. So I know at the DoD level, we're sort of putting more emphasis into it. But, the DoD is not the ones out there protecting the private industry. I think the sort of decentralized nature of the United States, not only in terms of critical infrastructure, but also in terms of state government, local government, county government, really limits what the feds can do. So I think we're always going to be kind of in a reactive mode because of that. And, and I think you bring a good point that, other, smaller countries with maybe a more, it's been more powerful, not more powerful, but maybe a more central government probably has a better time of it than we do. Yes, sir.
So besides the cyber training, which again here, Scott, of course, they also have DDS, the Digital Defense Systems or Services. They bring it in. People from the industry, from Google, from Amazon, and that they're doing 2-year stints, and they're advising the Joint Chiefs of Staff on how to better prepare our country and how to. And they're also auditing existing programs that already exist. So we do have a DDS that was created back under Obama's administration that's been working to do some improvements.
Oh, cool. All right. Yeah, I wasn't aware of that. So thanks for DDS.
DDS, Digital Defense Services.
Digital Defense Services. Great.
The person who was leading it just switched, they're changing out the leadership now.
And kind of similar to that, I can't remember the name of it, but there's this new sort of government internship kind of thing for cybersecurity people where you do basically an internship. If you're a cybersecurity student, you do an internship with the feds. You owe them like a couple years afterwards, and then they sort of help you get on with the private company. So kind of, I think a little bit, kind of almost like the flip side of what you're describing, right? Where the DDS invites private company experts in. Here, they're trying to, the Fed say, we'll give you a good high quality internship, if you do 2 years with us, and then we'll help you get on with the private sector. So there are some things like that going on. So thanks for that. We're just about out of time. I do want to get into a little bit of shameless self-promotion. There's my website and my email address, where I do digital forensics and incident response. So I'm actually a forensics guy. Before I joined Maryville about a year ago as a professor. Before that, I did incident response and forensics at IBM and Express Scripts and some other places. So if you need someone to do forensics, let me know. A couple more minutes. Oh, thanks.